In this video lesson, we'll talk about the roots of the Revolution and the impact of the Stamp Act on the colonies. The roots of the American Revolution were in a lot of ways that America had become a revolutionary force from the time that it was discovered. Eventually, there were two basic political ideas that shaped the minds and political thoughts of American colonists, people like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Jay. They were the idea of republicanism and a sense of corruption, moral failure, and decay within the monarchy and parliament, which threatened their liberties and rights as Englishmen. These political ideas defined the nature of a just society, the role of the citizen, and government, and borrowed from models of the ancient Greek and Roman republics. A republican society was defined as one in which citizens willingly put their own interests behind the common good of all, a concept based on the civic involvement, courage, selflessness, and virtue of the citizenry. The American concept of corruption was borrowed from English political critics known as radical Whigs, and widely read about by colonists. Their concepts were more than applied to England's monarchy. The radical Whigs, or Jugheads, were a group of British political commentators associated with the British Whig faction who were at the forefront of what's called radicalism. They played a significant role in the development of the American Revolution. As their Republican writings were widely read by the American colonists, many of whom were convinced by their reading that they should be very watchful for any threats to their civil liberties. So when the colonists were indignant about their perceived lack of democratic representation and taxes such as the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and the Tea Act, basically the colonists were very leery about these threats. Whigs considered political patronage and the use of bribery as corrupting threats to the civil liberties and rights of all Englishmen. In the colonies, republicanism and Whig ideals were amplified by the absence of titles and widespread property ownership and a higher level of political participation. Consequently, England's effort to tighten its control over colonial affairs following the French and Indian War was very sharply resisted by the colonists. Americans had grown too accustomed to running their own affairs. The British colonial empire was based on mercantilism, which was an economic system based on the principle that a country's political and military power was derived from its economic wealth. Wealth was power, and to amass wealth in the form of gold and silver, a country had to export more than it imported. Colonies existed as resources for raw materials needed to produce the products for export and a market for finished goods. Parliament enforced mercantilism by passing navigation laws. Americans felt disadvantaged by this and used the mercantilist system and considered it a violation of their rights as Englishmen, especially considering none of the American colonies were established directly by the Crown except for Georgia. Americans, therefore, questioned the legitimacy of the system, which gave them no direct influence or participation in the political process. England rejected American colonial desires for self-sufficiency or self-government, which was manifested in their passage of the Navigation Act of 1650. Later navigation acts required that European goods destined for America would first be landed in England, where they could be taxed, and then the products, some specific products, like tobacco, must go exclusively to England. Such economic policies created shortages of hard currency in the colonies, forcing Americans to engage in smuggling in order to make money. Parliament prohibited the colonies from printing paper currency, and they reserved the right to nullify any laws passed by colonial legislatures which conflicted with mercantilist policies of the British government. Americans rallied against such restrictions, claiming they were being sacrificed for the financial well-being of British commercialism. Mercantilism suppressed economic initiative. It made Americans dependent on British creditors and agents and kept them at an economic disadvantage. In actuality, Britain's navigation laws were only loosely enforced and posed no intolerable burdens on American colonials. Merchants and traders frequently evaded or disregarded the navigation laws, and some, like John Hancock, amassed fortunes through large-scale smuggling operations. Americans did benefit from the mercantilist system in a number of ways, though, including enjoying the protection of the world's most professional army and mightiest navy at no cost, receiving payment for generous cash bounties and producers of ships' parts and naval stores, and enjoying a virtual monopoly in the British Empire for tobacco production. Other problems facing American colonials following the French and Indian War were a succession of prime ministers and a new king determined to enforce their will on the colonies and force them to pay a fair share of the war's cost. Parliament believed that both the Proclamation Line of 1763 and the Revenue Act of 1764 were reasonable laws designed to help govern the colonies. Americans viewed the new laws as disturbing intrusions into colonial practices, including the right of colonial assemblies to raise taxes through elected representatives. The Revenue Act of 1764 failed to dissuade American smugglers and led to open confrontations between shippers and British officials in port cities such as New York, Newport, and Rhode Island. In 1765, George Grenville pushed the Stamp Act through Parliament, which placed a tax on all paper used for colonial documents, licenses, bills of lading, wills, court documents, and newspapers. The law required a special stamp be affixed to paper proving that the tax had been paid. The new law affected everyone who used any tax paper, and it became a major conflict between England and the colonies over Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts warned Grenville that the Stamp Act would create heated opposition and major trade disruptions in the colonies. Grenville argued that the British concept of virtual representation, the idea that Americans in the empire were virtually represented in Parliament, was not widely accepted by Americans. American colonial leaders rejected that concept and the right of a distant Parliament to tax them, and felt that the colonial assemblies should be able to tax their own. News of the Stamp Act's passage reached America in April 1765, and it was to become effective November 1st, 1765. Virginia's House of Burgesses objected to the act in something called the Virginia Resolves, which was a series of resolutions presented before the legislature by Patrick Henry. The 7 resolves stated that Virginians were British citizens, entitled to the same rights and privileges as citizens in England. They had the right to tax themselves through their elected representatives. Tax laws passed externally were illegal, and anyone disagreeing with the resolutions were enemies of Virginia. Newspapers throughout the colonies reprinted all 7 Virginia resolves, even though the House of Burgesses had already backed off 3 of the most extreme resolutions. Reaction to the resolves in the colonies left Parliament with the impression that it was a challenge to its authority, and that was going to continue. The Stamp Act forced everyone whose livelihood depended on the use of paper to comply with or defy the new law, boycott the use of official paper, destroy the stamped paper before the law took effect, thus preventing its distribution and ensuring noncompliance with the law. Samuel Adams, a radical leader known for his opposition to the Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson, organized the first resistance to the Stamp Act in Boston, Massachusetts. He organized a group called the Sons of Liberty, which was a group of dock workers, shopkeepers, laborers, and craftsmen who staged a large street demonstration highlighted by a mock execution of Andrew Oliver, a stamp distributor in Boston. Massachusetts Governor Francis Bernard took no action against the estimated 2,000 to 3,000 street demonstrators, but the Boston's stamp tax collector, Andrew Oliver, resigned his office the next day because he was fearful. Demonstrations organized by the Sons of Liberty in Boston provided some practical lessons. The governor learned that he could not govern without soldiers or police to back them. The Sons of Liberty learned that street demonstrations were very effective, and ordinary citizen participants in the demonstrations learned they could decisively impact politics. On August 26th, another demonstration attacked the homes of 4 officials, including Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house, destroying it and bringing demonstrations to a temporary halt in Boston. Protests in Boston by the Sons of Liberty sparked similar actions in nearly 50 towns throughout the colonies, forcing other stamp distributors to quickly resign their positions. In October 1765, the Stamp Act Congress met in New York City. It was comprised of delegates representing 9 colonial assemblies. The Stamp Act Congress drafted a petition to the King and Parliament, asserting that taxes were free gifts of the people and that only the people's representatives could give. The concept of virtual representation for Britain was unacceptable, and that affirmed the delegates' belief that they were subordinate to both Parliament and the King. By late 1765, Grenville was replaced by a man named Lord Rockingham, who immediately sought a repeal of the Stamp Act and to reaffirm parliamentary authority. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, but at the same time passes the